The cabin stood at the edge of a holler so deep that sunlight reached the bottom for only 3 hours each day. In the winter of 1878, smoke rose from its chimney in the early mornings, thin and gray against the Tennessee mountains, and then stopped abruptly around 9, as if someone had remembered they shouldn't draw attention. Inside lived a family named Halloran: mother, father, 3 daughters, and a boy of 7 years whose eyes were the palest blue anyone in those mountains had ever seen. The boy's name was Nathaniel, and he had not spoken a word in 14 months, not since the morning he woke screaming about the man standing in the corner of the room, the man with the rope burns around his neck and the darkness where his eyes should have been. The father had checked the corner. There was nothing there. But Nathaniel pointed and screamed until his voice gave out, and when his mother tried to comfort him, he looked at her with an expression of such profound terror that she would later tell the circuit preacher it was like looking into the eyes of someone who'd seen the actual gates of hell swing open. The next day, they learned that Nathaniel's uncle, his mother's brother, had hanged himself in a barn 40 miles away. Hanged himself at the exact hour Nathaniel had started screaming. And that was only the beginning. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Halloran family had lived in Sevier County, Tennessee since before the Revolution, part of that first wave of settlers who pushed into the Appalachian wilderness, seeking land and isolation from coastal society. They were Scots-Irish, Presbyterian, hardworking people who believed in God's providence and the devil's persistence in equal measure. Thomas Halloran, Nathaniel's father, worked timber and farmed a steep hillside that produced more rocks than corn. His wife, Esther, came from a family known throughout the mountains for what people called the sight, the ability some claimed to perceive things hidden from ordinary vision, to know events before they happened, to see the dead when they chose to appear. Esther's grandmother had been famous for it, could tell you which neighbors wouldn't survive the winter, which bobbies wouldn't make it to their first birthday. People feared her and sought her in equal measure, needed her warnings even as they resented her knowledge. Esther herself had only traces of the sight, occasional dreams that came true, moments of knowing that someone was sick or dying before word reached her. She'd hoped the ability would dilute further in her children, would breed out through marriage to Thomas, whose people had no such history. For the first 6 years of Nathaniel's life, it seemed her hope had been fulfilled. The boy was normal, healthy, bright, showing no signs of inheriting his great-grandmother's burden. Then came November of 1876 and the fever. It swept through the mountain communities that autumn, killed more than 30 people in Sevier County alone. Nathaniel caught it early in the outbreak. For 9 days he burned, delirious, twitching with convulsions, his small body racked by heat that shouldn't have been survivable. The local doctor, a man named Ephraim Cross who rode circuit through the mountain settlements, visited twice and both times told Thomas and Esther to prepare for burial. The boy wouldn't make it through another night. His temperature was too high, his heart was too weak. Death was certain, but Nathaniel survived. On the 10th day the fever broke. His temperature dropped to normal within hours. By evening he was sitting up, asking for water, acting as if nothing had happened. Dr. Cross called back to verify the recovery, examined the boy thoroughly and found him completely healthy, no lingering effects, no weakness, nothing to suggest he'd been at death's threshold. Cross wrote in his medical journal that the Halloran boy's recovery was the most remarkable he'd witnessed in 30 years of practice, a case that defied all medical understanding. He noted this with satisfaction, pleased to document a victory over the fever that had claimed so many others. He did not note, because he did not observe it, the change in the boy's eyes, the way they now seemed to focus on things that weren't visible, the way Nathaniel would track movement in empty rooms, following something with his gaze that no one else could see. The first incident after Nathaniel's recovery occurred in December of 1876. The family was at Sunday service in the small church that served their community, a rough building that doubled as schoolhouse during the week. Nathaniel sat between his parents, quiet and attentive as the preacher delivered his sermon about the valley of the shadow of death. Midway through the sermon, Nathaniel stood up. He walked down the aisle toward the front of the church, moving with the strange purposefulness of a sleepwalker, though his eyes were open. The congregation watched, uncertain whether to intervene. Nathaniel stopped at the front pew where old Mrs. Kershaw sat alone, her husband having died the previous spring. The boy looked at the empty space beside her and said, clear enough for everyone to hear, "He says to tell you he forgives you about the money." Mrs. Kershaw went white. She stood, gathered her shawl, and left the church without a word. Later, after the service ended and whispers had spread, someone remembered that Mrs. Kershaw's husband had accused her, in his final illness, of taking money from his savings to give to her brother. She denied it. He died believing she'd stolen from him. Nathaniel couldn't have known any of this. He was 7 years old, isolated on his family's remote homestead, with no access to adult gossip or family secrets. And yet he delivered a message that could only have come from a dead man, a message specific enough to shatter Mrs. Kershaw's composure completely. Thomas and Esther took Nathaniel home and questioned him gently about what had happened. Nathaniel said he'd seen a man sitting next to Mrs. Kershaw, an old man who looked sad. The man had spoken to him, asked him to deliver the message. When Thomas asked if Nathaniel had been frightened, the boy said no. The dead man seemed nice, seemed relieved to finally talk to someone. Thomas and Esther exchanged looks. They both recognized what was happening. The fever had done something, had opened something in their son that should have remained closed. Nathaniel had inherited the sight, but not in the diluted form Esther possessed. His ability was stronger, more direct. He wasn't sensing the dead or dreaming about them. He was seeing them, speaking with them, acting as a bridge between their world and the living one. Esther's grandmother had described such cases in her stories. Individuals born once or twice a century with the full manifestation of the gift, people who walked through life surrounded by the dead, unable to distinguish between those who breathed and those who'd stopped. These individuals rarely lived long, Esther's grandmother had said. The burden was too great. The dead were too demanding. And the living came to fear them, came to see them as cursed or demonic, came to drive them out or worse. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Through the winter and spring of 1877, Nathaniel's visions intensified. He would stop mid-chore to stare at empty spaces, would carry on conversations with people his parents couldn't see, would wake screaming from nightmares about crowds of the dead pressing close, all trying to speak at once, all desperate to send messages to the living they'd left behind. Esther tried to teach him to ignore the visions, to close himself off, to build walls between his mind and the things trying to reach him. Her grandmother's stories included techniques for managing the sight, mental disciplines that could limit exposure, could give the seer some control over when and how they perceived the other realm. But Nathaniel was too young to master these techniques, too overwhelmed by the constant assault of images and voices. And the dead, once they realized he could perceive them, began to seek him out. Esther would find her son standing in the yard at dawn, surrounded by early morning mist, speaking rapidly to presences she couldn't see, delivering messages she couldn't hear. The boy was becoming a conduit, a living switchboard between worlds, and the strain was visible in his deteriorating health, his increasing pallor, his withdrawal from normal childhood activities. The incident with his uncle in January of 1878 marked a turning point. Nathaniel's uncle, Esther's younger brother Samuel, lived in Knox County, a 2-day ride from the Halloran homestead. The families saw each other perhaps twice a year, maintained friendly relations but weren't particularly close. Samuel had been troubled for years, drinking heavily, struggling with debts, prone to dark moods that worried his wife and children. On January 14, 1878, Samuel Brennan hanged himself in his barn using a rope he'd purchased the previous week specifically for that purpose. He did this at approximately 6 in the morning. At that same moment, 40 miles away, Nathaniel Halloran woke screaming about a man with rope burns and empty eyes standing in the corner of his room. The boy's terror was so profound that he damaged his vocal cords with the force of his screaming, rendering himself unable to speak above a whisper for weeks afterward. Esther and Thomas tried to calm him, tried to understand what he was seeing, but Nathaniel could only point and sob, his small body shaking with fear that seemed excessive even for a nightmare. It wasn't until the next day, when a messenger arrived with news of Samuel's death, that the family understood. Nathaniel hadn't been dreaming. He'd been watching his uncle die, or more accurately, watching his uncle's spirit manifest in the moment of death, appearing to the one person who could perceive such things. The experience traumatized Nathaniel so severely that he stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through gestures and written words when necessary. Word of Nathaniel's abilities spread through the mountain communities despite the family's efforts to keep quiet. People began appearing at the Halloran homestead unannounced, desperate individuals seeking contact with dead loved ones, wanting messages delivered or questions answered. Thomas turned them away as gently as possible, explained that his son was only 7 years old, that the visions were a burden not a gift, that the family wanted privacy. But the desperate rarely take no for an answer. They'd camp at the edge of the property, waiting for glimpses of the boy, calling out names of the deceased, begging Nathaniel to look to see, to relay whatever messages might be waiting. Some offered money. Others offered goods, livestock, land deeds. A few offered threats, claimed that withholding Nathaniel's ability was cruel, that the dead had rights too, that the living deserved closure. Thomas, a patient man, began carrying a rifle when he worked the property. Esther kept the children inside more than was healthy, afraid of what might happen if strangers got too close to Nathaniel. The circuit preacher, Reverend Isaiah Hammond, visited the Halloran family in March of 1878. He'd heard the stories and wanted to assess the situation personally, to determine whether Nathaniel's visions were genuine spiritual phenomena or some form of deception or delusion. Hammond was a thoughtful man, educated at a seminary in Virginia, not given to superstition, but also not closed to possibilities beyond material explanation. He spent an afternoon with the family, interviewed Nathaniel gently, observed the boy's behavior, asked careful questions designed to test the authenticity of his claims. Nathaniel, still not speaking, wrote his answers on a slate. He described the dead as appearing similar to the living but slightly translucent, like images seen through water. He said they seemed confused often, didn't always understand they died, would ask him questions about why people couldn't see them or hear them anymore. He said some of the dead were peaceful, just passing through, barely visible, but others were desperate, obsessed with unfinished business, hovering around the living they'd left behind, growing increasingly frustrated when their presence went unacknowledged. Hammond asked if any of the dead were malevolent, if Nathaniel had encountered spirits that seemed dangerous. The boy hesitated, then wrote a single word on his slate: yes. When Hammond pressed for details, Nathaniel shook his head and wouldn't elaborate, but the fear in his pale blue eyes was eloquent enough. Reverend Hammond left the Halloran homestead troubled. He'd come expecting to find either fraud or childhood fantasy, but he'd encountered something he couldn't easily dismiss. Nathaniel's descriptions were too consistent, too specific, too psychologically complex for a 7-year-old child to fabricate. And there were the verified incidents, the messages Nathaniel had delivered that proved accurate despite his having no normal means of possessing such information. Hammond returned to his circuit preaching, but began researching historical accounts of similar cases, looking for precedents, for guidance on how such situations should be handled. He found scattered references in church archives, accounts from centuries past of individuals who claimed to see and speak with the dead. Most of these accounts ended badly. The seers were declared heretics or demon-possessed, driven from their communities, sometimes executed. A few were protected by the church, studied carefully, their testimonies recorded for theological analysis. But even these protected seers rarely lived past 30, worn out by the constant exposure to death, consumed by knowledge that human minds weren't meant to sustain. Hammond wrote in his private journal that the Halloran boy was likely doomed, that such gifts were curses in disguise, that the only mercy would be if the ability faded naturally as the child matured. But Hammond suspected it wouldn't fade. If anything, it would intensify. By summer of 1878, Nathaniel had regained his voice but used it rarely, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and even then in whispers. He developed habits that disturbed his parents, like refusing to enter certain rooms in their cabin, claiming they were too crowded with the dead. He insisted on sleeping with a lamp lit, said the darkness allowed them to come closer, to press in, until he felt he was suffocating under the weight of their presence. He began drawing obsessively, covering slate and paper with images of figures his parents couldn't see, faces that all shared a similar quality, something hollow-eyed and yearning. Esther kept these drawings, though she couldn't bear to look at them for long. They were too accurate, too detailed for a child's work. The faces had specific features, individual characteristics, looked like actual people rather than generic representations. And sometimes, when Esther looked at the drawings, she recognized faces from her own past, deceased relatives she'd never mentioned to Nathaniel, people who died before he was born. How could he draw them so accurately? The only explanation was the one she didn't want to accept, that Nathaniel was drawing from observation, sketching the actual dead as they appeared to him, creating a visual record of a realm that should remain invisible. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The incident that brought Nathaniel to wider attention occurred in August of 1878. A child had gone missing from a neighboring settlement, a girl of 5 named Rebecca Tanner who'd wandered away from her family's homestead and hadn't been found despite 3 days of intensive searching. The community feared she'd fallen into a ravine or been taken by wild animals or succumbed to exposure. Her parents were frantic. Someone, remembering the stories about the Halloran boy, suggested they bring Nathaniel to the search area, see if he could perceive anything helpful. Thomas initially refused, wanting to protect his son from such a traumatic situation. But Rebecca's father came personally, begging, and Thomas finally relented. They took Nathaniel to the area where the girl had last been seen. The boy stood very still for several minutes, his pale eyes scanning spaces the adults couldn't see. Then he started walking, moving with that same sleepwalker purposefulness he'd shown in church. The search party followed. Nathaniel led them nearly a mile from the last known sighting, through difficult terrain, until he stopped at the base of a small cliff. He pointed up. The searchers climbed and found Rebecca Tanner's body wedged in rocks 15 feet above ground level. She'd apparently climbed, fallen, struck her head, and died quickly. The body had been there at least 2 days, invisible from ground level, in a location the search parties had passed multiple times without noticing. Nathaniel had led them directly to it. The Tanner family was grateful for closure, but the incident cemented Nathaniel's reputation throughout Sevier County and beyond. The boy who could see the dead. The child who walked between worlds. People began treating him differently, with a mixture of reverence and fear that isolated him further from normal childhood. Other children wouldn't play with him, afraid of what he might see when he looked at them, afraid he might tell them about dead relatives following them around. Adults either avoided him entirely or sought him obsessively, still hopping for messages, for confirmation that their deceased loved ones persisted in some form. The family received letters from across Tennessee and beyond, from as far away as Virginia and North Carolina, people writing to describe their dead and beg Nathaniel to look for them, to see if they were still present, to relay any final words. Esther burned these letters unopened after the first few, unable to handle the desperation they contained, the raw need that words on paper couldn't adequately convey. Dr. Ephraim Cross, who'd attended Nathaniel during his near-fatal fever, returned to the Halloran homestead in September of 1878. He'd heard about the Rebecca Tanner case and wanted to examine Nathaniel again, to see if there were any physical changes that might explain his abilities. Cross was a man of science, skeptical of supernatural explanations, but honest enough to follow evidence wherever it led. He conducted a thorough physical examination and found Nathaniel healthy but unusual. The boy's pulse was slower than normal, his body temperature ran a degree below average, and his pupils showed a peculiar reaction to light, dilating and contracting in patterns Cross had never observed before. Most strikingly, the boy's eyes showed evidence of what Cross could only describe as additional structures, very faint formations in the iris that resembled secondary pupils or perhaps primitive light-gathering organs. Cross had never seen anything like them in any medical text. He couldn't say whether they were congenital or had developed after the fever, but he noted them carefully in his journal, along with the observation that Nathaniel's vision in darkness appeared to be far better than normal human capability. The boy could navigate the cabin at night without stumbling, could read by candlelight that would be inadequate for most people, could see details in shadows that should have been invisible. Cross theorized that whatever neurological changes the fever had caused, they'd affected Nathaniel's visual processing in fundamental ways, perhaps allowing him to perceive wavelengths or patterns invisible to normal human eyes. This didn't explain the specificity of Nathaniel's visions, the accurate messages he delivered, but it might explain the mechanism by which he perceived something that others couldn't. Reverend Hammond returned to the Halloran family in October, bringing with him another minister, a man named Josiah Blackwood who specialized in what he called spiritual maladies. Blackwood was older, severe, suspicious of any phenomena that might indicate demonic influence. He interviewed Nathaniel extensively, asked the boy to describe the dead in detail, to explain how they appeared, how they communicated, whether they ever tried to touch him or enter him. Nathaniel, intimidated by Blackwood's intensity, answered haltingly. He said the dead usually just wanted to talk, wanted to be acknowledged, wanted the living to know they still existed in some form. But he admitted that some were different. Some were angry or confused or so focused on particular obsessions that they became almost predatory, following living people relentlessly, trying to influence their actions, whispering constantly in ways only Nathaniel could hear. Blackwood seized on this, declared that these entities were likely demons masquerading as the dead, that Nathaniel's ability wasn't a gift from God, but a curse from darker sources, that the boy needed exorcism, or at minimum constant prayer and spiritual protection. Hammond disagreed. He argued that Nathaniel's visions might be genuine perception of an afterlife realm, that the boy could be a prophet of sorts, given insight into mysteries normally hidden from human understanding. The two ministers debated theology while Nathaniel sat silently between them, his young face showing exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness, the weariness of someone carrying knowledge too heavy for their years. The debate between Hammond and Blackwood represented a larger controversy developing around Nathaniel's case. Word had spread beyond Tennessee. Newspapers in major cities picked up the story, ran sensationalized accounts of the boy who talked to ghosts. Academic interest emerged. A professor from a college in Virginia wrote to Thomas Halloran requesting permission to study Nathaniel, to document his abilities for scientific purposes. Spiritualists, that growing movement of people who claim the dead, could be contacted through mediums and seances, sent representatives to meet the boy, wanting to recruit him for their cause, to use him as proof of their beliefs. Thomas refused all these entreaties. He wanted only to protect his son, to give the boy as normal a life as possible given the impossible burden he carried. But normal life was becoming increasingly impossible. Nathaniel was changing in ways that went beyond his visions. He was becoming more detached, more distant, as if the constant exposure to death was draining his connection to life. He ate little, slept poorly, spent hours staring at nothing visible, lost in communion with presences his family couldn't perceive. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Winter of 1878 brought new complications. Nathaniel began predicting deaths, not intentionally. He would simply mention casually that he'd seen specific living people accompanied by the dead, by gathering shadows that he said meant transition was coming. Within days or weeks, the people he'd mentioned would die from illness or accident or simply old age. The accuracy was disturbing. By January of 1879, people in the community were actively avoiding Nathaniel, afraid that his notice meant doom, that being seen by him would somehow hasten death. This wasn't true, of course. Nathaniel wasn't causing the deaths. He was simply perceiving the approach of death before it manifested, seeing the gathering of whatever forces or entities preceded the final transition. But terrified people rarely think rationally. Blame found easy targets. Whispers began that maybe the boy was cursed, that maybe his presence brought death rather than simply predicting it, that maybe the community would be safer if the Halloran family moved elsewhere. Thomas heard these whispers and made a decision. The family would relocate, would move deeper into the mountains, would find a place so isolated that Nathaniel's abilities wouldn't trouble anyone except themselves. In March of 1879, the Hallorans abandoned their homestead, sold what they could, packed what mattered, and headed west into the most remote regions of the Tennessee mountains. They settled in a hollow so steep and isolated that supplies had to be packed in on foot, where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, where the outside world couldn't intrude. Here, Thomas hoped, Nathaniel could grow up undisturbed, could learn to manage his visions without being exploited or feared, could maybe find some measure of peace. The first few months seemed promising. Nathaniel was calmer, less troubled, the constant pressure of other people's expectations lifted. He began speaking more, playing with his sisters, acting more like a child than he had in 2 years. Esther dared to hope that isolation might allow her son to develop normally despite his abnormal perceptions. But isolation brought its own problems. Cut off from community, from the comfort of other human presence, the family became more vulnerable to the things Nathaniel could see. The hollow where they'd settled was old, had been occupied before, though by whom no records showed. Nathaniel began reporting presences that weren't like the dead he'd seen before. These weren't confused spirits of the recently deceased. These were something else, something older, something that had never been human. He described them as shadows that moved independently of light, as shapes that hurt to look at directly, as voices that spoke in languages that predated English, that predated language itself perhaps. Thomas, skeptical, dismissed this as his son's imagination amplifying normal fear of a strange new place. But Esther, who'd grown up on stories of the mountains harboring more than just ghosts, wasn't so sure. She'd heard tales from her grandmother about things that lived in the deep hollows, entities that had occupied the Appalachian wilderness long before European settlement. Things that the Cherokee had known about and avoided, that marked certain places as forbidden for reasons white settlers rarely understood until too late. Nathaniel's behavior changed through the summer of 1879. He became fearful in ways he hadn't been before, would refuse to go near certain areas of the property, would wake screaming from nightmares about things that weren't dead because they'd never been alive, about geometries that folded space in impossible ways, about eyes that watched from angles human eyes couldn't perceive. He began drawing different images, not faces anymore but patterns, spirals and angles that made his family dizzy to look at, that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, that suggested depths and dimensions that shouldn't exist on flat paper. Esther burned these drawings immediately, instinctively recognizing them as dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. When she asked Nathaniel what he was drawing, he said he was copying what they showed him, the things that lived in the hollow, the ones who'd noticed he could see and were pleased to finally have someone to communicate with. Esther's blood went cold. She told Thomas they needed to leave, needed to find another place, that this hollow was wrong in ways that went beyond Nathaniel's visions. But Thomas, exhausted from the effort of relocating once already, refused. They'd committed to this place. They'd made improvements to the property. They had nowhere else to go and no money to start over again. They would stay and make it work. Through the fall, Nathaniel's reports about the things in the hollow became more specific and more disturbing. He said they were ancient, predated human presence in the mountains by millennia, had been here when the land was younger, when reality itself was more fluid. He said they were hungry, not for physical substance but for attention, for acknowledgement, for the energy that came from being perceived by conscious minds. Most humans couldn't see them, walked past them constantly without knowing they were there. But Nathaniel could see them clearly, and his perception fed them, made them stronger, more present. They wanted him to look at them. They needed him to look. And the more he looked, the more solid they became, until even his family began to sense their presence, began to feel watched when they moved around the property, began to hear sounds that had no natural source, began to see movement in shadows that should have been still. The hollow was changing, becoming more oppressive, as if the barrier between visible and invisible was thinning, as if Nathaniel's constant perception was bleeding the two realms together in ways that shouldn't be possible. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In November of 1879, Nathaniel's youngest sister, a girl of 4 named Margaret, disappeared from the cabin's interior in the middle of the day. One moment she was playing near the fireplace under her mother's watch. Esther turned away for perhaps 30 seconds to tend the cooking pot. When she turned back, Margaret was gone. The family searched frantically, checked every room, every corner, every possible hiding place. The child had vanished. Nathaniel, questioned urgently, said the things in the hollow had taken her, had pulled her into their realm, had been waiting for an opportunity to claim someone who couldn't resist. He said Margaret was still alive but existing in a space parallel to the cabin, visible to him but not to his parents, close enough to touch but unreachable through normal means. Thomas, desperate, demanded that Nathaniel bring her back, use whatever connection he had to these entities to negotiate his daughter's return. Nathaniel tried. He stood in the center of the cabin, speaking to presences his family couldn't see, pleading with things that responded in ways that made his young face contort with fear. After an hour of this, Margaret reappeared, stumbling back into view in the exact spot where she'd vanished, crying but unharmed. She couldn't explain where she'd been except to say it was dark and crowded and full of voices that wouldn't stop talking. This incident broke something in Thomas. He'd been trying to maintain normalcy, trying to convince himself that his son's visions were manageable, that isolation would protect the family from the worst consequences of Nathaniel's abilities. But Margaret's disappearance proved otherwise. Whatever Nathaniel could see, whatever he'd opened through his perception, was actively dangerous, could reach into their lives and take what it wanted. Thomas made the decision to leave the hollow immediately, consequences be damned. They would abandon the property, forfeit the improvements, go back to civilization even if it meant facing the prejudice and exploitation they'd fled. Anything was better than staying in a place where reality itself was compromised. The family packed that night, gathered essentials, prepared to leave at first light. But morning brought unexpected visitors. Reverend Hammond had returned, accompanied this time by a woman, elderly and native, who Hammond introduced as someone who understood such matters better than he did. The woman's name was given as Sarah Drowning Creek, though Hammond said this was an English approximation of her Cherokee name, that her actual name didn't translate properly. Sarah spoke little English but communicated through Hammond, who'd apparently learned enough Cherokee during his circuit preaching to serve as interpreter. She examined the hollow carefully, walked the property's boundaries, paid particular attention to Nathaniel, studied the boy with eyes that saw more than most people's. After her examination, she spoke at length to Hammond in Cherokee. Hammond translated haltingly. Sarah said the hollow was what her people called a thin place, where the membrane between worlds was naturally weak. Such places existed throughout the mountains, usually marked by her ancestors with warnings, left uninhabited or used only for specific ceremonial purposes. White settlers, ignorant of these markers, had built homes in thin places, and bad things resulted. She said that Nathaniel had been changed by the fever, had been given sight that bypassed normal human limitations, and this sight made him vulnerable to things that dwelled in thin places, made him visible to them in turn. The entities here weren't evil exactly, weren't demons in the Christian sense, but they were incompatible with human life, operated on principles that human minds couldn't properly process. Prolonged exposure would drive the family mad or worse. They needed to leave and never return. Thomas didn't need to be told twice. The family departed the hollow that afternoon, following Sarah and Hammond out. Sarah led them to a different location, several days' travel east, to a place she said was strong rather than thin, where the membrane between worlds was thick and solid, where Nathaniel's visions would be less intense, where the things he could see would have difficulty reaching him. This place was a small valley, sheltered by mountains, near enough to a settlement that the family wouldn't be completely isolated, but remote enough that Nathaniel's reputation might not precede them. Sarah performed what she called a shielding ceremony, created protections around the property, using methods that combined Cherokee spiritual practices with what Hammond uncomfortably recognized as older traditions, things that predated Cherokee occupation, knowledge that had been passed down from peoples whose names were no longer remembered. She told Nathaniel, through Hammond's translation, that he would always have the sight, that the fever had changed him permanently, but that these protections would filter what he perceived, would reduce the intensity, would give him some control over when and how he engaged with the other realm. She warned him never to return to thin places, never to seek out the dead deliberately, to use his ability sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. The sight was a burden, not a gift, and treating it otherwise would destroy him. The Halloran family settled in this new valley in December of 1879. The first months were difficult as they rebuilt from nearly nothing, but gradually they established a new normal. Nathaniel's visions continued but became more manageable, filtered through Sarah's protections, less overwhelming. He could see the dead when they appeared but could also block them out when necessary, could live something approaching a normal childhood. He began attending the local school, made a few friends who didn't know his history, learned to navigate social situations without betraying his abnormal perceptions. By his 10th birthday in 1881, Nathaniel seemed almost normal, a quiet boy with pale blue eyes who spoke little but listened well, who seemed older than his years but not damaged by whatever he'd experienced. Esther dared to hope that the worst was behind them, that her son would survive the curse he'd inherited, would grow to adulthood despite the burden he carried. But the sight was patient and the dead were persistent. Through Nathaniel's adolescence, the visions intensified again despite the protections. As he matured, his ability matured with him, became stronger, more precise. He could perceive not just the recently dead but those who'd been gone for decades, could see the accumulated layers of mortality that clung to places where violence had occurred, where suffering had been prolonged, where death had claimed multiple victims. The valley where the family had settled seemed peaceful on the surface, but Nathaniel's sight revealed other truths. The land had history, had seen conflicts between settlers and Cherokee, had witnessed murders and disappearances and unmarked graves. Nathaniel saw all of it, carried all those accumulated tragedies in his perception, couldn't walk through the valley without encountering the restless dead who wanted acknowledgement, who wanted their stories known, who would press close and whisper urgently about injustices and unfinished business, until Nathaniel thought he would go mad from the constant noise in his head. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? By age 15 in 1886, Nathaniel had developed coping mechanisms, ways of filtering the visions, techniques for maintaining boundaries between his perception and the intrusion of the dead. He carried herbs Sarah Drowning Creek had given him, burned them regularly to strengthen his protections. He practiced meditation, learned to quiet his mind, created mental walls that could block out the most insistent spirits. But the cost of this constant vigilance was isolation. Nathaniel had few friends, no romantic prospects, existed at the margins of normal society because he was always half-focused on maintaining his defenses, always aware of the crowd of invisible dead surrounding him, always exhausted from the effort of functioning in two worlds simultaneously. His family watched him struggle and could offer only sympathy, no real help. Esther sometimes wished the fever had simply taken him, spared him the prolonged suffering that the sight inflicted. But she kept these dark thoughts private, continued supporting her son, continued hoping that somehow his life would improve. What broke Nathaniel wasn't a single traumatic incident but accumulated weight. By his 20th birthday in 1891, he'd spent nearly 15 years perceiving the dead constantly, filtering thousands of voices, resisting countless attempts by spirits to use him as their messenger, their link to the living world they couldn't reach otherwise. The strain manifested in physical symptoms, headaches that lasted for days. Insomnia so severe he sometimes went a week sleeping only a few hours total, tremors in his hands that made fine work impossible, loss of appetite that left him gaunt, his already pale skin becoming nearly translucent. Dr. Cross, still practicing in the region, examined Nathaniel and found no specific illness, nothing medicine could treat. The boy was simply worn out, consumed from within by perceptions that human nervous systems weren't built to sustain. Cross wrote in High's journal that Nathaniel Halloran was dying slowly, killed not by disease, but by an excess of sight, by seeing too much for too long, by carrying the burden of two worlds without the biological capacity to process both. Nathaniel's final months were marked by deterioration that was heartbreaking to witness. He could barely eat, could rarely sleep, spent most of his time sitting motionless, his pale eyes tracking things no one else could see, his lips moving constantly in whispered conversations with the dead. Esther stayed by his side, tried to comfort him, but Nathaniel seemed barely aware of her presence, too consumed by his communication with the other realm to properly engage with the living. In his lucid moments, he would apologize to his mother, would say he'd tried to manage the sight, had tried to be strong enough to survive it, but it was too much. It had always been too much, and he was ready for it to end. Esther would hold him and weep, knowing there was nothing she could do, that her son had been doomed since the fever broke all those years ago, that the sight had been a death sentence delivered slowly over 15 years. Nathaniel Halloran died on March 7, 1892, 3 months before his 21st birthday. The cause of death was listed as general debility, which meant the doctor couldn't identify any specific organ failure or disease, just overall collapse. The family buried him in the local cemetery, placed a simple stone that gave his name and dates and nothing else. No mention of his abilities, no reference to the site, just the basic facts of his existence. The funeral was attended by family and a few neighbors, and Reverend Hammond, who'd maintained contact with the Hallorans over the years, who delivered a eulogy that tried to frame Nathaniel's life as meaningful, as a sacrifice born for reasons beyond human understanding. But Hammond's words rang hollow even to himself. What meaning could be found in a life consumed by visions, in 15 years of suffering that produced no clear benefit, in a gift that was purely curse? After the burial, Hammond confided to his journal that Nathaniel's death felt less like transition and more like release, like the universe had finally stopped torturing a soul that never asked for the burden it was given. But death didn't end Nathaniel's story. Within weeks of his burial, reports began circulating that people were seeing a pale figure in the cemetery, a young man with ice-blue eyes who stood among the graves and watched the living. Some claimed to have spoken with this figure, said he delivered messages from the dead, relayed information that only deceased loved ones would know. Esther, hearing these reports, recognized immediately what was happening. Her son hadn't escaped the sight. Death had simply moved him to the other side of it. He was now among the dead himself, still serving as intermediary, still communicating between realms, still trapped in the role that had defined and destroyed his life. The realization broke something in Esther. She'd hoped death would give Nathaniel peace, would free him from the burden he'd carried. But peace was apparently not available. The sight transcended mortality. Whatever neurological changes the fever had caused, whatever spiritual opening it had created, persisted beyond bodily death. Nathaniel was still perceiving both worlds, still walking between, still unable to rest. Esther Halloran visited Sarah Drowning Creek one final time in the summer of 1892. She asked if there was any way to release Nathaniel, to free him from continued service to the dead. Sarah listened and shook her head sadly. She said that some roles, once accepted, become permanent, that Nathaniel had walked the path of the seer so long he couldn't stop walking even after death, that he would continue as intermediary until whatever cosmic purpose his ability served was fulfilled, which might be generations, might be centuries, might be forever. She said the Cherokee had stories of such individuals, spirits who'd had special sight in life and continued serving as bridges after death, who existed in the liminal spaces until they faded entirely from memory and meaning. The best Esther could hope for was that Nathaniel's spirit would gradually dissipate over time, would thin until he no longer had sufficient presence to perceive or be perceived. But that process could take longer than living memory, could extend beyond the lifespans of everyone who'd known him, could continue until the very land changed, and the thin places either sealed themselves or opened completely. The sightings of Nathaniel's spirit continued sporadically through the 1890s and into the new century. Each account described the same figure, pale and young with eyes like ice, standing in graveyards or appearing at deathbeds, watching with an expression that mixed compassion and exhaustion. Some people found his presence comforting, proof of continuity beyond death. Others found it disturbing, a reminder that death might not bring the rest they hoped for, that some burdens persisted beyond mortality. By the 1920s, the sightings had become rare, just occasional reports that might be legend or imagination more than genuine perception. By the 1940s, Nathaniel Halloran had faded into regional folklore, another strange story from the old days, half remembered and rarely discussed. His grave remained marked but unvisited. His family's descendants, if any existed, had moved away or denied connection to the story. The site he'd possessed became just another Appalachian mystery, another inexplicable phenomenon in mountains full of things that defied rational explanation. But mysteries don't disappear simply because people stop talking about them. In 1973, during construction of a new highway through eastern Tennessee, workers encountered something unusual. They were excavating near the site of the old Halloran homestead in Sevier County, the place where Nathaniel had lived before the family's relocations. Buried in the soil at a depth that suggested deliberate concealment were dozens of objects, small carved stones that showed symbols similar to those Sarah Drowning Creek had used in her protection ceremonies. Archaeological analysis suggested the stones were far older than the Halloran occupation, potentially centuries old, potentially placed there by Cherokee or pre-Cherokee peoples who'd recognized the location as significant. The presence of these objects supported Sarah's claim that the area was a thin place, a spot marked by indigenous peoples as dangerous or sacred. The Hallorans had settled there unknowingly, had exposed their son to forces he wasn't equipped to handle, had triggered a cascade of consequences no one could have anticipated. The fever had simply been the catalyst, activating latent abilities that the environment then amplified beyond control. If Nathaniel had grown up anywhere else, in any less charged location, his sight might have remained dormant, might never have manifested strongly enough to notice. But circumstance and geography had conspired to create the perfect conditions for the gift to emerge, and once emerged, it couldn't be reversed. The question that haunts researchers who study Nathaniel's case isn't whether his visions were real. Too many verified incidents, too many accurate messages delivered, too many witnesses who had no reason to lie or collude. The question is what his visions revealed about the nature of death, consciousness, and the structure of reality itself. If Nathaniel truly could see the dead, if he could perceive a realm where consciousness persisted without biological support, then everything we believe about mortality needs reconsideration. Death wouldn't be ending but transition, wouldn't be darkness but different form of existence, wouldn't be escape but continuation under altered conditions. And if that's true, if death is merely a change of state rather than cessation, then the implications are both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggests we persist, that identity survives bodily failure. Terrifying because it suggests consciousness might continue indefinitely, trapped in whatever condition death creates, unable to progress or evolve, existing in a state of awareness without the capacity to grow or change. Nathaniel's testimony, delivered through his brief troubled life, and apparently continuing after death, suggests the afterlife might not be reward or punishment but simply more existence, existence stripped of physicality but still burdened with memory, with longing, with the ties that bound us to people and places during embodied life. And that leaves us with the final unanswerable question. If Nathaniel Halloran's spirit continues to exist, continues to perceive both the living and the dead, continues to serve as bridge between realms, is he aware of what he's become? Does he remember his human life, his family, his suffering? Does he understand that he's trapped in the role that killed him, that death offered no escape from the sight, that he'll be intermediary forever or until he dissipates into nothing? Or has death brought mercy in the form of amnesia? Has he forgotten who he was, become simply function without memory, perceiving and communicating without the burden of self-awareness? We can't know. The sightings that continued past his death offered no insight into his interior state, only evidence of his continued existence. He appears, he watches, sometimes he delivers messages. But what he experiences internally, whether consciousness persists for him in any meaningful sense, remains mystery. And perhaps that's the most disturbing aspect of Nathaniel's story, the possibility that he exists now in a state that's neither life nor true death, neither aware nor truly absent, trapped in some gray space between, forever serving a purpose he never chose and can never escape. A cautionary tale about the cost of seeing too much, about the danger of perceiving realms that should remain invisible, about the possibility that some gifts are curses so profound that not even death provides relief.